You don't know true silence until you've buried yourself in alien mud, praying your own ragged heartbeat doesn't give you away. They dragged us from the outer colonies, stripped us, dropped us into this sprawling violet-canopied nightmare just to see how fast we could run. They were 9 feet of armored muscle and silent malice, and they thought we were cattle. They thought they were the undisputed apex predators of the galaxy. That was before the sun went down, before the dark woods started to whistle. The mud in the lowland basin smelled like rotting fruit and ammonia. Cole pressed his cheek against it, feeling the grit bite into his skin. The cold was a living thing, seeping through his frayed cotton shirt, wrapping around his ribs and settling deep in his lungs. He didn't shiver. Shivering meant movement. Movement meant death. Beside him, Wyatt was losing his mind. It wasn't a loud unraveling. It was the subtle, terrifying breakdown of a man whose central nervous system had finally overloaded. Wyatt's breaths came in short, wet gasps. His fingers clawed mindlessly at the damp earth, tearing up clumps of pale, fungal moss. Cole didn't look at him. If he looked, he might try to comfort him. And Cole was too much of a coward to die for a 22-year-old kid he'd met 3 days ago on a transport ship. Breathe in, Cole told himself, focusing on a single, jagged pebble inches from his nose. Hold it. Let it out slow. A heavy thud vibrated through the ground. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a concussion you felt in your jawbone. The hunter was close. The air pressure seemed to shift. The ambient noise of the forest, the chittering of multi-legged insects, the rustle of the thick, waxy leaves overhead, evaporated. The local fauna knew when the lords of this world were on the prowl. Cole closed his eyes, mapping the threat by sound alone. Another step. A dry branch snapped, the sound unnaturally sharp. They weren't particularly stealthy, these giants. They didn't need to be. When you are 9 feet of interlocking chitin plates, whipcord muscle, and sensory organs tuned to the scent of fear, stealth is an insult to your supremacy. They walked like gods strolling through a garden. The smell hit him next. It was a harsh, metallic odor, like hot iron and an electrical fire. Ozone. It burned the back of his throat. Wyatt let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. Cole risked opening one eye. Through the tangled roots of a massive dead tree, he saw it. The creature stood perfectly still, its 4 lower limbs planted firmly in the loam. Its torso was elongated, armored in deep crimson and charcoal gray. It didn't have a face, not exactly. Just a smooth, domed carapace where a head should be, ringed with specialized sensory pits that dilated and contracted with a wet, clicking sound. It was listening, tasting the air. "Don't do it," Cole prayed, his mind screaming at the boy beside him. "Just eat the dirt, Wyatt. Swallow your tongue. Do not move." Wyatt couldn't take it. The pressure of being hunted, of waiting for the inevitable, broke whatever thin wire was keeping him grounded. He pushed himself up. "I can't," Wyatt gasped, a pathetic, broken sound. He bolted. Cole didn't reach for him. He squeezed his eyes shut and pushed his face deeper into the rotting mud. The hunter didn't roar. It didn't make a sound at all. There was only the sudden, violent displacement of air, a rush of wind, and the sickening sound of impact. It was the heavy, wet noise of a melon being dropped from a great height onto concrete. Wyatt screamed, but the sound was abruptly cut off, replaced by a wet gargle. Cole bit his lip until he tasted his own blood. His stomach heaved, a sour mix of acid and bile burning his throat, but he swallowed it down. He hated himself in that moment. He hated his instinct to survive at the cost of his own humanity. He felt the warm splatter of something wet hit the back of his neck. He didn't wipe it off. The hunter stayed for another 10 minutes. Cole could hear the tearing of meat, the rhythmic cracking of bone. The creature wasn't eating for sustenance. It was a display. It was enjoying the kill. Eventually, the ozone smell faded, replaced by the heavy metallic stench of fresh blood. The heavy footsteps receded into the brush, moving on to find better sport. Cole lay there for a full hour after the forest sounds returned. Only when a pale, glowing slug slithered across his knuckles did he finally move. He pushed himself up, his joints screaming, his muscles cramping so violently he almost collapsed. He didn't look at what was left of Wyatt. He couldn't. He wiped the gore from the back of his neck with a trembling, mud-caked hand, stared at the violet sky visible through the canopy, and started walking toward the rendezvous point. He was alive. He felt entirely dead. The rendezvous point was a sunken cavern beneath the roots of a monolithic tree, choked with glowing lichen that cast a sickly green pallor over everything. It smelled of unwashed bodies, infection, and despair. When Cole slid down the muddy embankment into the hollow, only 4 heads turned to look at him. 4. They had started with 20. Harding sat near the back, wrapping a strip of filthy cloth around his right hand. He was missing his ring and pinky fingers, lost in the initial abduction from the mining colony. Sarah sat beside him, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes staring at a spot on the dirt wall that didn't exist. She was maybe 30, but her hair had gone stark white in patches over the last week. A guy named Miller, a heavy-set cargo hauler who had lost 50 pounds in 7 days, was shivering uncontrollably in the corner. And then there was Hayes. Hayes just looked angry. "Wyatt?" Harding asked. His voice was a gravelly rasp. Cole shook his head. He found an empty patch of dirt and sank onto it, pulling a canteen from his hip. He took a sip. The water tasted of iodine and plastic. "That makes 15, Hayes spat, driving a sharpened piece of scrap metal into the dirt. 15 down. They're going to pick us off one by one until there's no one left to run. We need to keep moving. Head for the mountains." "They're faster," Cole said, his voice hollow. "They don't sleep. They don't tire. You run. You die tired." "So we just sit here?" Hayes snapped, standing up, his large frame stooped in the low cavern. "Wait for them to sniff us out?" "We're prey," Sarah whispered, her voice barely carrying over Miller's chattering teeth. "We act like prey. We run. We hide. We bleed." Harding stopped wrapping his hand. He looked up, his sunken eyes catching the green luminescence of the lichen. "Say that again." Sarah blinked, slowly pulling her gaze from the wall. "We bleed. Before that, we act like prey." Harding nodded slowly. He picked up a thick, broken branch from the cavern floor. "They dumped us here, unarmed. They don't use projectile weapons. I saw one of them take out Davis on the 2nd day. It had blades strapped to its forearms. It wants the physical contact. It wants the chase." "Get to the point, old man," Hayes muttered. "My point," Harding said, his voice firming up, shedding the exhaustion of the past week, "is that they are playing a game, and games have rules. Rule number 1, the prey runs away." Cole looked at Harding, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. "Harding, no. Whatever you're thinking, no. Cole, You saw what happened to Wyatt, Harding said, pointing his stump at Cole. You saw how they hunt, they track panic, they track a pounding heart, heavy breathing, the snap of twigs when we blindly sprint through the dark. They are 9 feet tall, Cole retorted, his voice rising, cracking with suppressed hysteria. They are plated in armor that a mining laser would struggle to cut. We have sticks. We have pieces of scavenged hull metal. A bear is bigger than a man, Harding said quietly. A wolf is faster. A tiger is stronger. Humans didn't conquer Earth because we had thick skin or sharp claws. We conquered it because we are mean, spiteful, stubborn bastards who learned how to throw rocks and use the dark. Silence fell over the cavern, broken only by Miller's ragged breathing. You want to fight them, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. I want to stop playing their game, Harding corrected. I want to break their rules. They expect us to scatter. They expect us to scream. Harding leaned forward, the green light casting deep, demonic shadows across his weathered face. What do you think a predator does when the rabbit stops running, turns around, and bares its teeth? It laughs, Cole said bitterly, and then it eats the rabbit. Not if there are 10 rabbits, Hayes interjected, a dark, dangerous spark igniting in his eyes. He looked at the sharpened metal in his hand. Not if the rabbit bites for the jugular. There are 5 of us, Cole pointed out, gesturing to the pathetic group. Look at us. Miller can barely stand. I threw up in my own mouth an hour ago. We aren't soldiers. We're humans, Harding said. He stood up. And right now, that's the only weapon we need. We don't need to overpower them. We need to confuse them. We need to make them second-guess their instincts just long enough to put a piece of sharp metal through whatever passes for their brain. Cole looked at his hands. They were coated in dried mud and Wyatt's blood. The urge to run, to hide, was overwhelming, but he was so tired. The exhaustion was a physical weight, crushing his spine. The idea of running again tomorrow, of waiting for the heavy thud of those massive feet. He couldn't do it. How? Cole asked, his voice a dry croak. Harding smiled. It was a terrifying, feral thing. We camouflage. Mud, top to bottom, masks the heat signature. We find a choke point. We rig the terrain. And then we call them in. Call them? Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. How? We make a noise, Harding said, but not a fear noise, not a scream, something they have never heard in these woods, something unnatural. Harding pursed his dry, cracked lips and blew. A sharp, clear, 2-note whistle echoed in the damp cavern. It was a stark, jarring sound, piercing, defiant. Cole shivered, not from the cold this time. The canopy above was so thick that midnight on this planet meant absolute, suffocating blackness. Cole crouched behind the rotting trunk of a fallen colossal tree. His entire body was caked in a thick layer of freezing mud, mixed with the pungent, ammonia-smelling sap of a local fern to mask his scent. He held a 3-foot length of jagged carbon fiber, scavenged from the wreckage of their drop pod. It was heavy, and the improvised grip wrapped in torn cloth dug into his palms. He was trembling. The adrenaline in his system was toxic, burning his veins, making his vision swim. 10 yards away, across a narrow ravine carved by a dried-up creek, Hayes was hidden in the roots. Harding and Sarah were positioned on the high ground, behind a cluster of boulders. Miller was the bait. They had placed Miller in the center of the ravine. They had smeared him in fresh blood from a dead local scavenger animal to ensure the scent was strong. Miller hadn't argued. He was too far gone in his fever to care. The silence of the woods was oppressive. Then, the ground vibrated. Thump. Cole's breath hitched. He forced his jaw relaxed, breathing strictly through his nose. Thump. The ambient noise of the insects died instantly. The predator was here. Through the pitch black, Cole could just barely make out the shifting of shadows. The creature was a darker void against the dark background. It moved with that terrifying, arrogant grace, stepping into the dried ravine. It had caught Miller's scent. Cole heard the wet clicking of the hunter's sensory pits. It paused. Usually this was the part where the human screamed, where the human scrambled backward, slipping in the mud, begging for a god that wasn't there. The hunter waited. It lived for the spike in the prey's heart rate, the flood of cortisol. Miller lay there, silent, unconscious, or dead. Cole wasn't sure. The creature took a step forward, a low, rumbling hiss escaping its unseen maw. It was confused. The prey wasn't acting right. It reached out with one of its massive scythed forelimbs, preparing to prod the motionless body. From the high ground, Harding whistled. Fwee-hoo! 2 notes, sharp, melodious, and completely alien to this world of grunts, screams, and tearing flesh. The hunter froze. Its massive head snapped toward the sound. The chitin plates on its back flared out, a defensive posture Cole had never seen before. It let out a short, aggressive click. A second later, from across the ravine, Hayes answered the call. Fwee-hoo! The creature spun, its scythes raised, slicing through the empty air. It took a step back, away from Miller. It was agitated now. The sensory pits on its head were working furiously, trying to locate the source of the noise, but the sound bounced off the dense wood and rock. Cole felt a strange sensation well up in his chest, pushing past the terror. It was a cold, sharp spike of clarity. The monster was confused. The god was bleeding confidence. It was Cole's turn. He pressed his lips together. His mouth was dessert dry, but he forced the air out. Fwee-hoo! The hunter lunged toward Cole's position, closing the distance with terrifying speed. But it was blind. It slashed at the fallen tree, tearing a massive chunk of wood away, showering Cole in splinters. Cole didn't flinch. He stayed low. From above, Sarah whistled. A long, sustained, eerie single note. The creature roared. It was the first time Cole had heard one vocalize. A deafening, metallic shriek of absolute frustration and rising panic. It spun in a circle, slashing at the shadows. It didn't understand. The prey was everywhere, and the prey wasn't running. Now! Harding screamed from the rocks. They didn't charge like heroes. They swarmed like rats. Hayes was the first to strike, dropping from the roots above. He drove his sharpened scrap metal directly into the gap between the creature's neck plates. The hunter shrieked, bucking wildly. Hayes was thrown off, smashing hard into the ravine wall, but the blade stayed lodged in the creature's flesh, leaking thick, luminescent blue fluid. Cole didn't think. The paralyzing fear that had gripped him for 7 days shattered, replaced by a primal, blinding rage. He vaulted over the log. The creature was thrashing, trying to reach the blade in its neck with its lower arms. Cole slid into the mud, ducking under a wild, sweeping strike of a scythe that sheared the top of a boulder off. He drove his carbon fiber spear upward, aiming for the soft, unarmored joint behind its lower knee. He hit bone, or whatever passed for it. The creature collapsed on one side, screaming that metallic shriek. Harding and Sarah were there a second later, They didn't have spears. They had heavy, jagged rocks. They brought them down on the creature's domed head, over and over and over again, in a chaotic, desperate frenzy. The hunter thrashed, its sheer strength hurling Sarah 10 feet away into the mud, but Harding held on, smashing a stone into the sensory pits. Cole ripped his spear free, the blue blood hot and acidic against his hands. The creature tried to rise, its jaws snapping blindly, catching Harding by the arm. The old man screamed as teeth sheared through muscle. No, Cole thought, a feral roar tearing from his own throat. Not another one. You don't get another one. He gripped the carbon fiber spear with both hands, planted his boots in the mud, and drove the jagged point directly into the center of the creature's domed carapace, putting every ounce of his weight behind it. The spear punctured. The creature went rigid. A terrible, shuddering vibration ran through its massive frame, and then it collapsed, pinning Harding beneath its bulk. Silence slammed back into the woods. Cole stood over the corpse, his chest heaving, his breath tearing in and out of his lungs like sandpaper. He let go of the spear. His hands were shaking so violently he couldn't form fists. Hayes limped over, clutching his ribs, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. He looked at the dead, 9-foot god bleeding out into the mud. Together, Cole and Hayes pushed the heavy corpse off Harding. The old man was pale, his arm a mangled mess, but he was breathing. Sarah crawled out of the brush, covered in mud and blue blood, staring wide-eyed at the kill. No one spoke for a long time. The reality of what they had just done was too massive to process. They hadn't just survived. They had fought back. Harding clutched his bleeding arm, looking up at Cole. Through the pain, the old man's lips curled into a weak, bloody grin. See? Harding whispered, his voice barely a rasp. Just animals. Cole looked down at his own hands, coated in the neon blue blood of an apex predator. He didn't feel heroic. He felt sore, exhausted, and sick. But as he looked out into the pitch-black woods, he realized something had changed. The forest didn't feel quite so large anymore, and the dark didn't feel quite so terrifying. From somewhere deep in the woods, miles away, the heavy concussive thump of another hunter echoed through the ground. Cole didn't flinch. He wiped the blue blood on his pants, looked at Hayes, and nodded. Hayes pursed his lips. Fwee-hoo, let them come. The blue blood dried fast. It didn't flake like human blood. It hardened. Within 20 minutes, Cole's hands felt like they were encased in tight, cracking plastic. Every time he curled his fingers to grip the makeshift stretcher, the dried fluid pulled at his arm hair, a constant stinging reminder of the corpse they'd left behind in the mud. Adrenaline is a liar. It makes you feel like you can punch through a starship bulkhead. Then it leaves, and the bill comes due. Cole's knees kept buckling. The muscles in his thighs fluttered erratically, a spasm that made him stumble over exposed roots and slick, moss-covered rocks. Keep it up, Hayes grunted from the front of the stretcher. Hayes wasn't looking back. He just kept pulling. Between them, suspended on a lattice of stiff fern fronds and wrapped in a tattered thermal blanket, was Harding. The old man was conscious, which was arguably worse than if he'd been knocked out. His face was the color of dirty chalk. Sarah walked beside him, her hands pressed firmly against the makeshift tourniquet she'd rigged around his mangled bicep. Miller was gone. They hadn't buried him. You don't waste calories digging holes for dead men when monsters are tracking you. The hunter hadn't killed him. His own body had. Miller's fever had spiked. His breathing had turned into a wet death rattle, and by the time they'd pushed the heavy alien corpse off Harding, Miller's chest had simply stopped moving. Cole felt a terrible, heavy guilt that his primary emotion upon realizing Miller was dead wasn't sorrow. It was relief. One less liability. One less mouth breathing too loudly in the dark. "Stop," Sarah whispered. Hayes froze. Cole dropped his end of the stretcher a fraction of an inch before catching himself, his shoulders burning. "What?" Hayes breathed, his hand instinctively going to the sharpened scrap iron tucked into his belt. "Listen." Cole strained his ears. The forest was waking up around them. The violet canopy above was turning a bruised, swollen purple as the alien sun began its slow crawl over the horizon. Insects clicked. Something slithered through the high canopy, raining condensation down on them. Then he heard it, a low, resonant hum. It vibrated through the damp earth, traveling up through the soles of Cole's ruined boots, settling in his teeth. It wasn't the heavy, concussive footfall of a single hunter. It was a sustained, mechanical drone. "They found the body," Hayes said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "We need to move faster," Sarah said, her eyes wide, scanning the dense thicket of pale, thorny vines surrounding them. "They're going to know it wasn't a bigger predator. They're going to look at those wounds and know it was us." "Good," Hayes spat. Cole stared at him, a hot flare of anger pushing through his exhaustion. "Good? Are you out of your mind? We killed one. One, Hayes. By sheer dumb luck. We caught it off guard. Now they know we bite. They aren't going to casually stroll into a ravine and let us drop rocks on them anymore." "Cole's right," Harding wheezed from the stretcher. His eyes were squeezed shut, his jaw tight. The game just changed. They aren't hunting cattle anymore." "So what do we do?" Hayes demanded, turning back. The large man looked haggard, his beard matted with mud and sweat. "We roll over? We just let them pick us off?" "No," Cole said. His voice surprised him. It sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else. He looked at his plastic-coated hands. "We don't roll over, but we don't pick fights we can't win. We need high ground, real high ground. Somewhere they have to climb to get to us." "The ridges to the east," Sarah suggested. "I saw them from the drop pod before it crashed. Sheer rock faces, lots of caves." Cole nodded. "We head east, and we don't stop." They picked up the stretcher. The weight of it felt twice as heavy as it had 5 minutes ago. As they pushed through a thick cluster of waxy, broad-leafed plants, Cole caught a scent on the air. It wasn't the metallic ozone of the hunters. It was something sweet, cloying, and faintly rotten. It smelled like overripe peaches left to ferment in the sun. He didn't know what it was, but on this planet, anything new was a threat. "Keep your eyes open," Cole muttered, his grip tightening on his carbon fiber spear. They walked for another 3 hours as the bruised sky lightened into a harsh, glaring white. The temperature spiked. The cold, wet mud of the basin gave way to hard-packed, arid dirt. The towering trees thinned out, replaced by jagged formations of black, porous rock. They were exposed. "Put him down," Sarah gasped. "Please, I need a minute." Hayes didn't argue. They lowered Harding gently into the shadow of a large, jagged boulder. Sarah slumped against the rock, her chest heaving. Cole leaned on his spear, trying to get enough oxygen into his lungs. The air here was thinner, hotter. It burned on the way down. Harding let out a low groan. The bandages around his arm were soaked through, turning a dark, rusty brown. "It's infected," Sarah said softly, not looking at anyone. "The mud, the dirt, It's already red, creeping up to his shoulder. I'm fine, Harding rasped, forcing a weak smile. It looked like a grimace. Just give me some water. Cole reached for his canteen, unscrewing the cap. He had maybe 3 swallows left. He tilted it toward Harding's cracked lips. The old man drank greedily, choking slightly, water spilling down his chin. Save some, Hayes warned, eyeing the empty horizon. We don't know where the next stream is. Cole ignored him, letting Harding drain it. You don't ration water to a dying man, and Harding was dying. Cole knew it, Hayes knew it, Sarah knew it. As Cole capped the empty canteen, a sound echoed across the rocky expanse. Fwee-hoo. Cole's blood turned to ice. He looked at Hayes. Hayes was staring back, his eyes blown wide, his hand gripping his iron blade so hard his knuckles were white. Sarah scrambled backward, pressing herself flat against the boulder. Fwee-hoo! It came from the north, a sharp, melodious, 2-note whistle, exactly like the one Harding had taught them. Except Harding was lying on the ground, half conscious, and Cole hadn't made a sound. They're mocking us, Hayes whispered, a tremor of genuine fear finally cracking his angry facade. No, Cole said, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt sick. A deep, cold nausea settled in his gut. They aren't mocking us. They're communicating. They learned the signal. The sun beat down on the black rocks, turning the jagged formations into natural ovens. Cole pressed his back against the rough stone, the heat seeping through his filthy shirt, burning his skin. He didn't care. The heat was real. The heat was something he could understand. Fwee-woo! The sound drifted over the rocks again. This time, it came from the south. They're flanking, Hayes hissed, his chest rising and falling rapidly. They know we're in this cluster. They're trying to flush us out. Don't move, Cole ordered, his voice barely a breath. Don't make a sound. The absolute worst thing they could do right now was run. The hunters were massive, but they were fast. Out here, in the open, with no dense canopy to break their line of sight, the humans would be run down in seconds. Cole squeezed his eyes shut. He tried to think. He tried to apply logic to a nightmare. If I were a 9-foot apex predator, and I just found out my prey could kill me, what would I do? I wouldn't charge blindly, Cole thought. I would use their own trick against them. I would make them think they were surrounded. I would make them panic. They want us to bolt, Cole whispered. They're trying to push us out of the rocks. We can't stay here, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Harding is burning up. We need shelter. We move, we die, Hayes snapped. We stay, he dies, Sarah shot back, pointing at Harding. The old man was shivering violently now, despite the oppressive heat. His skin was pale and slick with sweat. The red lines of infection had crawled past his shoulder, spiderwebbing up his neck. Cole looked at Harding, the man who had convinced them to fight back. The man who had taken a scythe to the arm so Cole could drive a spear into a monster's skull. I am a coward, Cole thought, the realization bitter and metallic in his mouth. I want to leave him. He's slowing us down. If we leave him, the hunters will stop for him. It will give us time. The thought shamed him so deeply, he felt a physical ache in his chest. It was the brutal lizard brain logic of survival. It was the exact logic the hunters relied on. No. Cole gripped his spear. I am a human being. I am not cattle. Fwee-woo! The whistle was closer this time, just on the other side of the rock formation. Then came the smell. Ozone and hot iron rolling over the rocks like a physical wave. Cole, Hayes whispered, panic finally bleeding into his tone. Cole, what do we do? Cole didn't have a plan. He had a stick and a whole lot of terror. He looked at the narrow gap between their boulder and the next one. It was a tight squeeze. A human could slip through. A 9-foot hunter, burdened by its heavy carapace and wide shoulders, would have to turn sideways, maybe even crawl. "Hayes," Cole said, his voice steadying, pulling authority out of thin air. "Take Sarah, drag Harding through that gap. Get into the middle of the rock cluster. There's a depression there, looks like a dried-up spring. Hide." "What about you?" Sarah asked. "I'm going to give them an answer," Cole said. Hayes didn't argue. He grabbed Harding under the arms. Sarah grabbed the old man's legs. Harding let out a weak, muffled cry of pain as they hoisted him up, but they moved fast, dragging him toward the narrow fissure in the rocks. Cole watched them go, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was alone. He stepped out from the shadow of the boulder into the blinding sunlight. The heat hit him like a physical blow. The glare off the black rocks was disorienting. He squinted, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. 30 yards away, cresting a massive slab of basalt, was a hunter. It was larger than the first one. Its carapace wasn't charcoal gray. It was a deep, iridescent black, catching the harsh sunlight in oily smears. Its 4 lower legs moved with terrifying segmented precision. The sensory pits ringing its domed head were dilating rapidly, taking in the heat, the light, the scent. It saw him. The creature didn't roar. It didn't charge immediately. It stood there, silhouetted against the glaring white sky, an ancient, unstoppable force of nature. It raised its scythed forelimbs and clacked them together, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed like a gunshot. Cole's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the spear. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn and run, to dive into the rocks, to hide. Instead, he planted his boots in the dirt. He took a deep, ragged breath, filling his lungs with the hot, thin air. He pursed his lips. "Fui hu," he whistled back. The hunter froze. Its domed head tilted slightly, an eerily inquisitive gesture. It didn't expect defiance, not out here in the open. Cole didn't wait for it to process the confusion. He broke into a sprint, not away from the creature, but parallel to it, charging toward a cluster of loose, jagged shale perched on the edge of a steep drop-off. The hunter reacted instantly. The arrogant stroll vanished, replaced by a terrifying, scuttling sprint. It was impossibly fast, clearing the rocky terrain with massive leaping bounds. Cole scrambled up the shale, his boots slipping on the loose stones, tearing his fingernails on the sharp edges. He reached the top just as the creature closed the distance. The hunter launched itself into the air, its scythes extended, a massive armored missile aimed directly at Cole's back. Cole didn't turn around. He threw himself forward, diving off the edge of the shale pile, sliding face first down the steep, rocky embankment on the other side. The hunter hit the pile of loose shale with the force of a freight train. The trap wasn't complex. It was just gravity and bad footing. The immense weight of the creature, combined with the momentum of its leap, struck the unstable pile of rock. The shale gave way with a deafening crack. Hundreds of pounds of sharp, jagged stone cascaded downward in a localized landslide. The hunter let out a startled, metallic screech as the ground vanished beneath it. It thrashed wildly, its scythes biting into empty air as it tumbled down the steep embankment amidst an avalanche of black rock. Cole rolled to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, bruised, battered, his forearms scraped raw. He scrambled to his feet, coughing on the thick cloud of dust. Through the haze, He saw it. The hunter had landed heavily at the bottom of the ravine, half buried under the fallen shale. One of its lower legs was bent at a sickening, unnatural angle. Thick, blue fluid was leaking from a crack in its dorsal carapace. It wasn't dead, but it was broken. It thrashed, letting out a deafening, sustained shriek of rage and pain, trying to pull itself out of the rubble with its scythed forearms. Cole didn't hesitate. He didn't feel brave. He just felt a cold, mechanical necessity. He picked up a heavy, jagged piece of basalt, nearly as large as a cinder block. He walked up to the thrashing, screeching creature. He didn't look at its terrifying scythes. He didn't look at the leaking blue blood. He looked only at the domed carapace. He raised the rock above his head. "My turn," Cole whispered. He brought it down. The crunch of the carapace was sickening. It felt less like breaking bone and more like shattering a thick pane of safety glass. Blue fluid erupted, splattering across Cole's shins, burning with a mild chemical heat. The massive creature shuddered violently, a localized earthquake beneath the shale, and then went entirely limp. Cole dropped the rock. He stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat as the dust settled around him. The silence returned to the ravine, heavy and absolute, broken only by the faint hiss of the creature's acidic blood eating into the dry earth. He had done it alone. He looked at his hands. They were scraped raw, bleeding red blood that mixed with the alien blue. He felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his chest, a manic, dangerous sound that he forced back down. If he started laughing, he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop. 2, he thought. That's 2 dead gods. He turned away from the carcass and began the brutal climb back up the embankment. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. His ribs ached where he'd hit a stone during his slide, and his left knee was swelling rapidly. When he finally crested the ridge and slipped back through the narrow fissure into the rock cluster, he found Hayes and Sarah huddled over Harding in the dried-out spring bed. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide, ringed with dark purple circles of exhaustion. She saw the fresh blue blood on Cole's pants, the rock dust coating his hair. "You?" she started, her voice faltering. "It's dead," Cole said flatly. He slumped against the stone wall, sliding down until he was sitting in the dust. He closed his eyes. "The landslide caught it. I finished it." Hayes stared at him, a complex mix of awe, relief, and resentment playing across his grim face. "They're going to keep coming, Cole. That whistle. If they all know it now, they're going to use it to hunt us down." "I know," Cole rasped. He opened his eyes and looked at Harding. The old man was still, too still. Sarah followed his gaze. She looked down at Harding, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his neck. She pressed her fingers against his carotid artery for a long, terrible moment. She slowly pulled her hand back. She didn't cry. She just stared at the dirt. "He's gone," she whispered. Cole felt a heavy, cold weight settle in his stomach. Harding was the spark. Harding was the one who had told them to stop running. Now, he was just another body left in the dirt of a hostile world. "We take his knife," Hayes said quietly. It sounded callous, but Cole knew it was just the calculus of survival speaking. Hayes reached down and unclipped the small, dull folding knife from Harding's belt. "We can't stay here," Cole said, forcing himself to stand. His legs felt like lead. "We killed 2. They aren't going to send 1 or 2 next time. They're going to send a pack. We need to reach the eastern ridges before nightfall." They left Harding where he lay. There was no ceremony. There were no words. They just turned their backs and started walking. The journey to the ridges was a grueling, sun-baked nightmare. By midday, they were severely dehydrated. Sarah was stumbling, her lips cracked and bleeding. Hayes was limping, using his sharpened iron like a walking stick. Cole's mind was slipping into a hazy, detached state. He felt like he was watching himself walk from a few feet behind his own body. Left foot, right foot, breathe. The landscape changed again. The flat black rocks gave way to a steep, uphill incline. The ground became treacherous, covered in a thick layer of slippery ash-like dust and tangled roots of petrified trees. The sun began its descent, turning the sky from white back to that bruised, violent violet. They reached the base of the eastern ridges just as the shadows began to stretch and distort. The cliff face was massive, a towering wall of porous rock rising hundreds of feet into the air. It was pockmarked with dark, yawning cave entrances. "There," Sarah gasped, pointing a trembling finger at a wide fissure about 40 feet up the cliff face. "We can defend that. It's a choke point." "We have to climb," Hayes grunted, looking up at the sheer rock. "We climb, or we die at the bottom," Cole said. They started up. It was slow, agonizing work. The rock was brittle, flaking away under their grip. Cole went first, finding footholds, pulling himself up inch by painful inch. He reached down to help Sarah, grabbing her wrist, hauling her up over a tricky outcropping. Hayes followed, his heavy frame struggling against gravity. They were 10 feet from the cave entrance when the whistling started. It didn't come from one direction. It came from the dense tree line they had just left behind. Fwee woo, fwee woo, fwee woo. It was a chorus. 5, maybe 6 distinct whistles, harmonizing in a twisted, alien mimicry of human defiance. Cole froze on the rock face, looking back over his shoulder. Emerging from the tree line, stepping into the fading light at the base of the cliff, were 4 hunters. They moved in perfect, terrifying unison. They didn't scuttle. They didn't rush. They stood at the bottom of the cliff, looking up at the 3 fragile, exhausted humans clinging to the rock. They were trapped. One of the hunters, larger than the rest, covered in heavy, scar-marred chitin, raised its scythed arm and pointed directly at Cole. It let out a low, rumbling hiss. It wasn't a roar of rage. It sounded almost conversational. It sounded like a promise. "Climb!" Cole screamed, grabbing Sarah by the belt, hauling her forcefully up toward the cave lip. "Move! Move! Move!" They scrambled over the edge, collapsing onto the hard, uneven stone floor of the cavern. The air inside was cool, smelling of damp earth and old dust. Cole scrambled to his feet, ignoring the screaming pain in his knee, and rushed back to the ledge. He looked down. The hunters weren't throwing themselves at the cliff face. They were methodical. 2 of them remained at the bottom, their sensory pits dilating, keeping watch. The other 2, including the scarred leader, were digging their massive scythed forearms into the porous rock. They were climbing, and they were fast. "They're coming up," Cole shouted, stepping back from the ledge. He hefted his carbon fiber spear. It felt pitifully light in his hands. "Hayes, the left side. Sarah, get behind us. If they get past us, run deeper into the cave." Hayes stood up, gripping his iron scrap, his breathing ragged. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked tired. "There's no running deeper, Cole. It's a dead end. I can smell the stagnant air. This is a tomb." Cole looked around the dim cavern. Hayes was right. It wasn't a tunnel. It was just a shallow hollow in the rock, maybe 30 feet deep. There was nowhere else to go. This was the end of the line. The mud and the meat. Cole tightened his grip on his spear. He could hear the scratching, scraping sounds of heavy claws tearing into the rock face just outside. They were close. "Harding said we're humans," Cole whispered, his voice trembling, but his jaw set. "We're stubborn bastards." He stepped up to the edge of the cavern entrance, standing in the fading violet light. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dusty air. He didn't whistle this time. He just waited for the monsters to show their faces. The sound of their ascent was not a scramble. It was the methodical, terrifying crunch of scythed limbs punching deep into the porous cliff face. Clack, crunch, drag. Cole stood 3 feet from the ledge, his knees bent, the carbon fiber spear slick with the sweat pouring from his palms. Beside him, Hayes was breathing in ragged, wet hitches. The large man looked terrible. His skin was the color of old wax in the dimming light, and his hands trembled violently around his scrap iron. "If they get a hold of you," Hayes said, his voice entirely flat, "don't let them pull you down. Make them kill you up here. If they pull you down, they won't finish it right away. You saw Wyatt." Cole didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was locked tight, his pulse hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm in his ears. He focused on the lip of the cave. A small cascade of loose pebbles tumbled over the edge, clattering against the stone floor. Dust plumed into the air, catching the last violet rays of the alien sun. Clack, crunch. The smell hit them first. The harsh burning odor of ozone and hot metal, concentrated and heavy in the stagnant cave air. A hand crested the ledge. Not a hand, a massive segmented claw, the deep black chitin scarred and pitted. It slammed down onto the stone, cracking the rock beneath its weight. Cole didn't wait for the head to appear. The paralyzing terror that had ruled his life for the past week evaporated, replaced by a cold, blind hostility. He lunged forward, driving the tip of his spear downward, aiming for the soft, fleshy joint where the claw met the forearm. He struck true. The spearhead punched through the fibrous tissue. The hunter let out a deafening metallic shriek, an ear-splitting frequency that rattled Cole's teeth in his skull. The creature thrashed, yanking its arm back. The sudden, violent motion wrenched the spear from Cole's grip, tearing the skin off his palms. He stumbled backward, falling hard onto the uneven floor. He had lost his weapon. "Hayes!" Cole shouted, scrambling backward like a crab as the massive domed head of the hunter rose over the ledge. Hayes didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, raising his rusted iron slab above his head with both hands, bringing it down with all the desperate strength he had left. The iron struck the creature's sensory pits with a sickening crack. Blue blood sprayed across the rock. The hunter shrieked again, its heavy lower mandibles snapping wildly. It lunged, hauling its immense 9-foot bulk over the ledge and crashing into the cave mouth. Hayes tried to pull his iron free, but the jagged edge was wedged deep in the creature's cracked carapace. The hunter swiped its good arm blindly. The heavy scythed forearm caught Hayes square in the ribs. The sound of breaking bone was sharp and distinct, like dry branches snapping under a boot. Hayes was lifted off his feet, thrown backward into the cavern wall. He hit the stone with a wet, heavy thud and crumpled to the floor. He didn't get back up. "No!" Sarah screamed from the darkness behind Cole. The hunter was in the cave. It rose to its full height, its armored back scraping against the low, jagged ceiling, showering them with rock dust. It was bleeding from the joint and its face, the neon blue fluid glowing eerily in the encroaching gloom. The sensory pits flared angrily, zeroing in on Cole's rapid, shallow breathing. It stepped forward, blocking the entrance completely. The fading light behind it cast its massive silhouette into deep, terrifying shadow. Cole had nothing. No spear, no rocks, just his bare, bleeding hands. He backed up until his spine hit the back wall of the cavern. The stone was cold and damp. He pressed himself against it, his mind racing, searching for an out that didn't exist. "This is it," a small, exhausted voice whispered in his head. "Just close your eyes. It will be fast." He felt a profound, overwhelming urge to just sit down, to stop fighting. He was so tired. He hadn't slept in 3 days. He had eaten nothing but bitter roots. He had watched 3 people die. He just wanted to close his eyes and let the dark take him. The hunter hissed, stepping deeper into the cave. It raised its uninjured scythe, preparing for the downward strike. Something small and dull flashed in the peripheral gloom. Sarah broke from the shadows. She wasn't holding a spear or a rock. She held Harding's folding knife, a pathetic 3-inch blade meant for cutting rations. She didn't scream. She didn't make a sound. She threw her entire body weight forward, tackling the hunter's injured foreleg. The creature stumbled, off balance. Sarah drove the small knife directly into the soft, unarmored crease behind its lower knee joint. She twisted the blade. The hunter roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It bucked violently, kicking out with its massive leg. The sheer force of the blow caught Sarah in the shoulder, sending her skidding across the rough stone floor. The creature dropped to one knee, its heavy bulk crashing against the cavern wall. The ceiling shuddered. Large chunks of porous rock broke loose, raining down on them. Cole stared at the beast. It was crippled, bleeding, thrashing in the confined space. He didn't want to die. He realized it with absolute crystalline clarity. He didn't want to die in a dirty hole on a nameless rock. He wanted to go home. He wanted to drink a glass of cold water. And this giant, arrogant insect was standing in his way. Cole pushed off the wall. He threw himself at the thrashing hunter, diving for the carbon fiber spear still lodged in its forearm. He grabbed the shaft with both bleeding hands. The creature snapped its massive jaws at him, the hot, ammonia-laced breath washing over his face. Cole ignored it. He planted his boot firmly against the hunter's armored chest, let out a raw, guttural scream of pure spite, and ripped the spear free. He didn't back away. He spun the spear around, reversing his grip, and drove the blood-slicked point directly into the creature's cracked sensory pit, burying it as deep as it would go. The hunter convulsed wildly, its limbs going rigid, and then collapsed onto the cave floor. Cole fell back, his chest heaving, his lungs burning like they were full of acid. He stared at the corpse, the blue blood pooling around his boots. He didn't have time to process it. Clack, crunch, drag. The second hunter, the scarred leader, was at the ledge. The cavern felt smaller now, the air thick with pulverized rock and the metallic, cloying stench of blue blood. The scarred leader didn't roar. It didn't need to. It simply adjusted its weight, its massive carapace scraping against the jagged ceiling, and began to advance. It was a black, oily silhouette of pure malice, the only illumination coming from the faint, dying flickers of bioluminescent lichen clinging to the cave walls. Cole backed away until he felt the cold, unyielding stone of the rear wall against his spine. He reached behind him, fingers scrabbling against the rough surface, searching for anything. A loose stone, a shard of debris, a miracle. His left arm hung limp, a dead, throbbing weight at his side. His ribs felt like a shattered ceramic plate with every shallow breath. "Sarah," he rasped, his voice a dry, shredded thing. "Get back, now!" She didn't move. She was a statue of shock, staring at the beast. The leader sensed her paralysis. It shifted its massive armored head, its sensory pits clicking with a frantic, wet precision as it locked onto the girl's terrified heartbeat. It raised its scythes, two jagged, serrated scythes that had ended countless lives, and crossed them in a slow, rhythmic clack. It was playing with them. It knew they were cornered. "Hey!" The voice was thin, almost a ghost of a sound. Hayes was propped against the base of the cave entrance, his head lolling. A dark, viscous pool was spreading beneath him, glistening in the gloom. He clutched his side with one hand, his fingers stained deep crimson. In his other, he gripped a jagged chunk of limestone that had broken away from the ceiling during the initial collapse. The hunter paused. It turned, its massive frame pivoting with unsettling grace. Hayes looked up. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, but his jaw was set with a final, desperate resolve. He didn't look at the monster. He looked at the ceiling above it, where a web of deep, unstable fissures webbed across the porous rock, held together by nothing but luck and time. Hayes coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and spat a glob of blood onto the floor. "Hey, you oversized bug," he wheezed, his voice gaining a sudden, ragged strength. "Look up." He didn't throw the stone at the hunter. He hammered it with every ounce of his remaining life force into the largest, deepest fissure in the roof. The cavern shrieked. A deep, tectonic groan vibrated through the floorboards of the world. Dust began to pour from the ceiling like sand in an hourglass. The leader realized its error too late. Its sensory pits flared wide, a frantic, high-pitched whine emitting from its domed head as it scrambled backward, its massive, awkward limbs kicking at the dust. It wasn't enough. The cavern roof surrendered. The roar was absolute. It was the sound of the earth itself coming down. A slab of rock, massive and unforgiving, plummeted from the darkness above. It didn't just hit the floor, it pulverized it. The impact drove the scarred leader into the ground, its lower half vanishing beneath a mountain of rubble. The creature let out a sound then, a piercing, metallic, and utterly human-sounding wail of confusion and agonizing shock. Then came the darkness. The entrance to the cave collapsed entirely, sealing off the outside world. The cloud of pulverized limestone and ash was instantaneous and blinding. Cole pulled his shirt over his face, curling into a ball as smaller stones pelted his back. The roaring sound of the collapse echoed and multiplied in the tight, airless space until he felt his skull might split open. Then silence returned. Not the ambient silence of the woods, but a heavy, pressurized, suffocating silence. Cole lay in the pitch black, his lungs screaming as they tried to pull oxygen from a throat full of dust. He coughed, a violent, tearing spasm that brought up grit and copper. "Hayes?" he whispered, his voice disappearing into the void. There was no answer, only the faint, intermittent sound of shifting debris. The monster was still breathing. Through the suffocating dark, Cole heard the agonizing, rhythmic scrape of heavy chitin against stone. The leader was pinned, its lower body crushed into the bedrock, but its upper torso remained free. It was thrashing with a mindless, dying fury, dragging its ruined self toward them. The sound of its scythes dragging across the rock was like a blade on a whetstone. Scrape, clack, scrape, It was coming for them, fueled by nothing but the blind, evolutionary instinct to kill before the spark went out. Cole reached out with his good hand, his fingers brushing the broken, splintered shaft of his carbon fiber spear. He didn't feel brave. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a rat backed into a corner, with nothing left to lose but the dark. He stood up, trembling, and began to crawl toward the sound of the monster's dying breaths. Time lost its meaning in the sealed tomb. Cole drifted in and out of a feverish, pain-filled sleep. The cold of the cavern seeped into his bones, warring with the hot, throbbing ache of his dislocated shoulder and battered ribs. The smell of death, human and alien, was thick and nauseating. He woke to the sound of shifting rocks. "Cole." Sarah's voice was dry, cracking with thirst. "Yeah," Cole rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Look." Cole forced his eyes open, groaning as he shifted his weight off the alien corpse. A thin gray beam of light was piercing the darkness. The sun was coming up. The light filtered through a small gap near the top of the rubble pile that blocked the cave entrance. "It's morning," Sarah whispered. Cole sat up, clutching his useless left arm. "We have to dig out, before we suffocate, before the others figure out a way up." They crawled to the rubble pile. It was a daunting wall of jagged stone. They worked in silence, using their good hands to pull the smaller rocks away, gradually widening the gap. It took agonizing hours. Cole's fingers were raw, his nails broken and bleeding, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The instinct to see the sky again overrode the pain. Finally, the hole was large enough. Cole pushed his head and shoulders through the gap, wriggling out onto the narrow ledge outside the cave. The light was blinding. The harsh white sun of the alien world beat down on the porous cliff face. Cole squinted, pulling himself fully out of the hole, then turned back to drag Sarah out. She emerged covered in gray dust, looking like a ghost. They sat on the ledge, breathing in the fresh, hot air. The landscape below them stretched out for miles, a vast alien forest of violet canopies and black rock formations. It was beautiful. It was a graveyard. Cole looked down at the base of the cliff. His breath hitched. The two remaining hunters were still there. They stood perfectly still at the edge of the tree line, looking up at the cave. They hadn't left. They were waiting for their leader to return, or for the prey to inevitably try and climb down. Sarah saw them and let out a broken, hopeless sob. "They're still there. Cole, we can't fight them. Not again." Cole looked at his trembling hands. He was battered, broken. He was barely standing. The idea of lifting a rock, let alone fighting another 9-foot monster, was physically impossible. He looked back into the dark cave. "We don't have to fight them," Cole said, his voice strangely calm. He turned back to the hole in the rubble. He reached inside, grasping blindly in the dark until his hand found the heavy, jagged edge of one of the scarred leader's severed scythes, broken off during the cave-in. It was incredibly heavy. It took every ounce of strength he had left in his right arm, his muscles screaming in protest, to drag the heavy, chitinous blade out onto the ledge. He hauled it to the edge, the metal-like material scraping loudly against the stone. He stood up, standing silhouetted against the bright sky. He looked down at the two hunters. They were watching him, their sensory pits dilating. Cole didn't say a word. He kicked the massive scythe off the ledge. It tumbled down the cliff face, bouncing off the porous rock, before slamming into the dirt at the base of the cliff, right in front of the two remaining monsters. The hunters stepped back, startled. They looked down at the massive, scarred weapon of their pack leader. Cole took a deep breath. His lungs ached, his ribs burned, but he forced the air out. Fwee woo! The sharp two-note whistle echoed off the cliff face, carrying far over the violet canopy. It wasn't a call for help. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was a warning. Sarah stood up beside him. She leaned against his good shoulder. She pursed her cracked lips. Fwee hoo! The two hunters froze. They looked at the severed scythe in the dirt. They looked up at the two small, battered humans standing on the ledge, covered in the neon blue blood of their gods. The creatures didn't roar. They didn't strike their forelimbs together in a display of dominance. For the first time in the history of their violent, arrogant species, they hesitated. The strict, unyielding rules of their hunt had been broken. The prey wasn't running. The prey was staring down at them from the high ground, covered in the gore of the apex predator. One of the hunters took a step backward, then another. It turned around, its heavy footfalls surprisingly quiet as it retreated into the shadows of the dark woods. A moment later, the second hunter followed, vanishing into the thick undergrowth. They were gone. Cole stood on the ledge, the harsh wind whipping his filthy hair around his face. He watched the tree line for a long time, waiting for the concussive thump of their return. It never came. He looked at Sarah. She was crying, silent tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. Cole wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her close. They were still stranded on a hostile alien world. They were starving, injured, and thousands of light years from home. But as Cole looked out over the sprawling, deadly forest, he knew one thing for certain. They weren't the prey anymore. If this story of humanity refusing to break in the darkest corners of the galaxy kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Humanity doesn't roll over, and we love sharing the grit, spite, and triumph of our species. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of what humans are capable of when our backs are against the wall. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss another HFY sci-fi epic. We are the Apex Predators. Let the galaxy know in the comments below.